So to start off, I actually thought we would just think about that sort of, you all work on or with comics in different ways, whether you're studying them or you're writing about them or you're theorizing about them. And I think a lot of us here in the audience too have experience working with comics in an academic context or a creative context or just being fans. And so I'm curious what you see as sort of your relationship with the media in terms of enjoying it on a personal level and also making it or studying it, and sort of what inspires you, or what do you see on a personal level that then you want to study, or what do you study that then makes you want to go out and read something you might like. And that question is open to anyone, so.
Well, that's a really large question. I think that I wrote a whole book to answer it. So I'm not really sure that I can, I'm not really sure that I can answer it in any brief, clear way. I would say that for me, I had a long relationship with comics. It started with superhero comics when my father was in the military, so I moved to Germany before I was even 6, and then somewhere around 7 or 8, picked up and I talk about this in Keeping It Unreal extensively, picked up a Wonder Woman comic book that had her black twin sister, as they called her at the time, on the cover, Nubia, and was just kind of entranced by that image. So it was kind of like just an iconic being drawn, sort of being drawn into the icons, of superhero comics, which for me just became a way for me to imagine all kinds of things. I never felt limited to whatever was in the comic. The comic always allowed me to sort of imagine other things, and part of what I could imagine with Nubia was just Black power in a particular way that I loved, and it was beautiful and was, amazing. So that was where it began for me. I just started reading a lot of comics. I stopped reading comics when I got to college, just didn't have time, wasn't that interested anymore, and that was, early 80s. And then I started back again, late 80s, with reading Sandman and Love and Rockets were the only two things that I read. And in fact, I realized watching the documentary last night that Love and Rockets is the only comic I've got every single issue of, and every single thing that's published by you two guys, I've always bought. I don't care about double dipping, I just get it. So that's, I don't know, so that's my quick answer, is just that. And I wanted to think about what about that imaginative engagement with comics was sustaining for me and vital for me in terms of my life, in terms of navigating an anti-Black, homophobic world that I live in. And there's a lot that's available for me in that, and that's what I wanted to write about, and that's how I moved into writing about comics as an academic. My training is in literature, so that's not, I write about literature most of the time, but comics has always been there for me, so.
So I would, is this on? Do I have to press something? It's on already. So I would say I also come to this as a reader first. For me, it was the early 90s, so Sandman, but also the beginning of Image. So I was one of those Spawn fans. Am I the only one who loved all of the the new Image comics? But I would say, as a kid growing up, while I was a big fan of a lot of comic strips, I didn't go to a lot of comic book stores. I wasn't sure that that was a space where I would be welcome, as sort of as Corey was talking about earlier. And so for me to then become more interested in this material as a reader and as an academic, and to look back and see letters that are written to the U.S. Senate defending EC Comics that are from Black readers in my hometown in Virginia in the 50s. And I'm like, my aunt could have written this, or this could have been my mom or grandma or whatever. There's a kind of something really rewarding about remapping and understanding of a past I thought wasn't accessible to me. And that has been, again, personally, something that's been important as I do this work. And then, I also was one of the folks, I sort of stumbled across comic studies when I was preparing for a class, and like many of us of this generation, sort of like, am I allowed? I can do this. I can study this work full time, and it's okay. So that has been really nice. I'm fortunate to work at a place that has welcomed that. Not all institutions do. And so that's sort of some of my perspectives on my relationship to comics.
My father's a cartoonist, so I grew up with all sorts of comics around. So I see it as a medium, and comics are a very underrated medium at that, because they're so visual. You know, it's so visual, yet it's so personal because they're books. So you're there and you're seeing representation, or you're not seeing representation. And I love that it could be any way. There's no right way to make a comic. There's so many different styles and approaches that can be done, and I find that wonderful. And
I want to backtrack just a little bit and say that Matt and I are dissertation fellows as part of this convening of scholars and artists, and so we're in the process of researching and writing new research about comics. I'm particularly working on how like teachers and students who want to be teachers are thinking about using comics in their classroom, and I really appreciated Qiana, how you talked about youth in your presentation. Mm-hmm. And so my question, I think, is both of you, Darieck and Qiana, you started to talk about yourselves as youth readers, but I was curious, how was like comics positioned in your classroom experiences? And then Natalia, how were comics talked about in your class experiences, like in K-12 schooling?
Ooh, that's good. I'm thinking not at all. Like, I don't think. In my
I was going to guess that, but I didn't want to
okay. In my K-12 experience, I don't. It was still sort of seen as something you did in your leisure time. I've reached a point. There was a point during the early 2000s where everyone who took a class with me had read Mouse or Fun Home. Mm-hmm. And then I went through a period where all the students had only known manga. And so it's sort of like interesting to see the different generations. But for me, it was on maybe Golden Legacy. Do you remember those? The black comics that they sold in churches. They were about like Benjamin Banneker.
Right,
they would put them in. Okay, well, anyway, that Classics Illustrated, maybe that was about it.
Did you bring comics to school with you, like to read?
No, I didn't.
Would you have been afraid to like open one around a teacher?
Yes. I remember some friends who snuck in copies of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This is before they were kid-friendly. And I was like, what is this? This is exciting, But no, I would have been reluctant to do that.
I would lug around the graphic novel version of Coraline to school a lot. Nice. But most of my schooling, it was mostly a boys' club. Like, they would talk about comics, and then there'd be, arguments about Thor and the Hulk and what's going to happen. And I would chime in, and they would just look at me like, huh? And I was like, whatever. And it wasn't until later where mostly the girls were reading manga. But it wasn't like a thing. It was just kind of talked about amongst friends until I went to an art school later where more people were interested in comics.
When did you graduate high school, if you don't mind me asking?
2018.
Okay. So no comic units in any of your English classes when you were?
No comic.
Okay.
So you're asking...
I'm asking about your relationship to comics in like public institutions in school.
So
like the way either you were made to feel about reading them by teachers, or the way if your teachers were using them with you, or if they were encouraging you to read them or talking about them with you.
No, they weren't encouraging me to talk about them, and they certainly weren't taught in any way. I do remember, I think about 4th grade or 5th grade, having a Mad magazine in class that I brought to, I don't know why it was there. And I was reading it, and the teacher, who I loved, that teacher, my 5th grade teacher, she said, I think those are good because I have good vocabulary in this thing. So, that was, it's like a vocabulary expanding exercise to read the Mad magazine. I do recall that, but that really is the extent of it.
I had a great teacher, a U.S. history teacher, who was very excited to show me the Senator John Lewis book, March. But she only showed me because she knew I made comics. And I thought, why isn't this part of the class? She's like, she was so excited about it. And I hope that it later became part of the curriculum.
Fingers crossed. We're trying. We're trying. I shouldn't speak for all teachers, but we are. We are trying.
And as sort of a follow-up on that, do you, Qiana and Darieck, try to use comics in your teaching, or have you really brought that in?
I haven't really. I mean, I've tended to put one comics text in something. So when I teach a class on basically about the novels that take slavery as a theme that started being published in the 1970s and 1980s, you know, at the end we'll see Kyle Baker's Nat Turner or something. But I haven't. I've actually taught twice a graduate PhD student course on comic studies. It was comic studies and queer studies. That was partly designed by my friend Ramsey Fawaz, who I'd co-written the introduction, where we co-edited American Literature Special Issue called Queer About Comics. And so we did this class together. He did it at University of Wisconsin, I did it at Berkeley. So we had this kind of whole you know, curriculum of comics that we had to figure out how people could get it and all that stuff. And I really enjoyed those classes. They were not, you know, I've had a lot more students for other classes, so I'm not sure whether Berkeley students are that interested in it. Yeah, I don't know. But I've done it a couple of times. I'm probably going to do it again and see how it goes. But those have been the only two times I've really focused on comics in a class.
Mm-hmm. So I teach at the University of South Carolina. I teach one comics class every year, but I find ways to work a graphic novel into every class I teach now. So when I teach African American studies, I actually end with March. Sometimes when I'm teaching African American literature, I have been lately bringing in Ebony Flower's Hot Comb, which is excellent, excellent. Everyone should read it. On occasion, I've taught YA literature. I bring in This One Summer. I teach a slavery and literature class. We read Nat Turner. So I try to like bring something in whatever that I'm teaching.
Can either of you talk a little bit about like some of the surprising things that have surprised you that students have said, or like in their reactions to reading comics in an academic space?
Just because this is top of mind, because we were just talking about this, when students say it took me 5 minutes to read that, I'm like, we got to stop everything. Stop everything. Because that's why I was like, I heard Frank Miller on a documentary one time say that my job as an artist is to get you to slow down and read this and see all that I'm doing. And I'm like, you're going to have to slow down. So read it again. Take that extra 5 minutes right now. That's always something that I find that comes up a lot. And I'm also surprised by the number of students who will often privately or in some other kind of way say, I don't know how to read this. Do I pictures first, words first? Is there a certain way? And so some of those, despite the fact that comics are very, you know, they're everywhere, I still get those types of questions. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I would echo the last point. That's the only thing that I can think of that surprises me. But people do. I mean, I was on a committee once where Berkeley was, where we had a committee we were selecting for freshmen. They all had to read the same book, and so we were considering. I put some, you know, graphic novels, as we call them, on the list. And you know, several people on the committee were like, I don't know how to read this. This doesn't. Yeah. I'm thinking, where am I supposed to go with my eyes are supposed to go? Like I'm seeing a picture. There's some letters and some words. You know, it was surprising. I just thought, oh, well, this is just kind of the thing you do. But I've been doing it since I was 6, so for me, it just is second nature. So that was surprising. But as a general matter, with students, I think most of them seem. Even putting aside the comic studies classes where obviously they would have some familiarity with it, but even when I introduced like Nat Turner into a slavery and literature class, people seem to know, they have some familiarity with the form, and it's not particularly surprising for them to have it there, and it's not, and I don't find that what they're saying about it is all that odd, so I'm not that surprised by it.
What I found about introducing friends to comics is a lot of the times they didn't realize how vast it is, how much is out there. That there's like, well, I know about the superhero stuff, so they weren't really interested in that. And I try to introduce them to something else. Was it Liz Suburbia's book? I can't remember the name, but I remember lending it to a friend. And she was amazed. Sacred Heart, yeah. That there was books like that even existed. And I was like, yeah, and there's so much more. And I don't know, I find that interesting that comics aren't pushed enough as they should be as like a vast medium. Like you can find, there's something for everybody out there. So I guess what I'm trying to say, yeah.
I think that actually that idea of comics not being pushed enough, or maybe put another way, sort of denigrated or seen as, you know, just for kids sometimes, I think that sort of relates, Darieck, to what you were talking about sort of this idea of like reclaiming the fantastic, and the idea of seeing fantasy as something that's important and not just fluff, you know, very superficial. And so I was sort of wondering, in that same vein, a question I had was, going forward, what would you all be interested to see in comics, whether that's academically or just as a fan, that you think would sort of be a positive development in the culture or the medium? I should say the cultures, there's not one comics culture, but.
So what we want to see in comics?
Right, what would interest you going forward?
More perspectives.
More
I mean, we
perspectives,
have a lot, but I guess just seeing people's lives, I guess people of color, I want to see more cartoonists of color telling their own stories. I think a lot of the times people breaking into comics feel they have to go into an already established medium, whether, you know, it's Marvel or DC, or, which is great, but I want to see people's minds. What else can you come up with, I guess? Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking, I mentioned Hot Comb before. We don't have enough graphic memoirs by Black women. I searched really hard to assemble them into my class, and I think we need more of those. A few come and go, and they're out of print. Now I think about Jennifer Crute, a few others. I would really like that. And I'd also like to find, I think everyone who I've talked to, I've somehow ventured into talking about webtoons, even us today over lunch. And I don't feel that I do enough to talk about webcomics and digital comics. So I'd like to figure out ways to bring that into my classes more. There's some really good scholars who are doing work in that area, but it hasn't yet made its way to my syllabus.
I think in some ways I feel like there's so much in comics that I'm almost more catching up than I have particular desires for things to happen. I know I respond to things that that strike me viscerally as innovations or as powerful in a particular way. Like my favorite thing is monsters, just because of the lined page, the lines, and like the reproduction of a notebook page and all the pictures and the lack of paneling. You know, there's way of telling a story. So I love stuff like that. I don't necessarily have in my own mind a particular desire for kinds of stories. I think the way that I've always read comics is that they're offering me something that isn't something that I would have created on my own, because I don't think the way a comics artist or a comics writer writes or thinks. And I get something from it that becomes a springboard for me for imagining in all kinds of different ways. So I take what I get in a certain way without necessarily expecting a lot of any particular thing.
And what about in terms of academic research? Like what kind of new lines of inquiry are you hoping that you might be able to read? I don't know. That's asking you to think of the thing.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said in terms of the kind of work that Qiana's doing and that I'm doing as well, where we're thinking about representations of race in comics and not thinking about it just as, here are some positive representations and here's some negative, that whole very tired sort of argument, but looking at the way that race is functioning in all kinds of comics, whether or not it's explicitly articulated as an issue of concern on the part of the creators, or it's even something that's discussed, especially by the more vocal parts of the audience. You know, it's always there, especially for American comics. It's, I think probably any comics in the Americas, period. So it's something that I think there's a lot to be said about it that hasn't been said. There's a lot to be investigated in terms of the history of representation and the mechanics of representation. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me a lot is what Gilbert and Harvey were talking about, the cross-hatching. That's a way that I think about. One of the first things I wrote about comics was about Love and Rockets back in the mid-90s when I was in graduate school. And I was looking at how there's a difference between the way that Charles Schulz does Franklin, the black character, with the lines that go across his face in order to indicate he's got a dark face, which is also the kind of lines you would see with Pigpen, who had a dirty face. And then the difference in the way that they would represent characters who were darker skinned or of African descent or whatever. And I think more discussion about that would be really interesting too. I would like to see more scholarship about that, more people who are actually artists, as I am not, talk about it and think about that out loud, as it were. So yeah, I think that's definitely. And then also, for me, there's an interesting thing too about, and this is partly, you know, development of the Comics Code Authority, which is, we talked about earlier today, you know, was the, after the Senate hearings, the idea that comics created juvenile delinquency and promoted homosexuality and were responsible for all the ills of the world. And the Comics Code Authority came in to create a lot of censorship about what could be represented. That superhero comics certainly followed, underground comics did not. I think there's a way where the exploration of sexuality is something which always remains, I mean, I guess it's like Gilbert was saying, there's a lot of fetish going on. There's a lot of sort of subtext that isn't brought to the fore. I'm not sure what happens if you bring it to the fore, but I'm interested in thinking about what the effects of the suppression of representation of sexuality, what those effects are in a range of comics. And even when they show up in, say, porn comics, how do they show up and what are the limitations there? Those are all things that I'm interested in as well.
Well, I did mention digital comics before, even though there are a lot of people already starting to do a lot of good work in that area. I will veer a little off the question and say, in my work as editor at Inks, it's really nice to see new scholarship coming in. I welcome and would like to see more young, new, promising scholars who cite more than McLeod and Hillary shoot. That would be welcome. And that are aware and can talk comfortably about form. I think some of those things can get lost sometimes. So that's my plug.
So I guess then just as one sort of closing question, Darieck, just now you brought up questions about representation and sort of complicating things beyond just saying this is a positive or a negative representation. And also, Qiana, you brought up in your talk the idea of this sort of ambivalence on the behalf of publishers about if it's not that they were somehow opposed to, it's not that the creators were, opposed to more inclusive racial representation, but there was this fear of basically we might court controversy with it. And I was wondering if you all had thoughts now, because I think there's some similarities and differences between that sort of thinking and the current politics of representation, when it's often celebrated but in a very commodified, limited way. And if any of you, Natalia, as well, had thoughts on what you see as representation in current popular culture, what are particular valuable forms or what really resonates with you that you see, versus is it sort of a, the flip side might be it's more of a marketing gimmick that you don't think is actually helpful?
Well, I do want to mention in terms of art styles that you're talking about in Love and Rockets and their representation, is I guess it opens up a can of worms, but you're just drawing people, and it's simple as that. And then we have to question, art classes in general. Are you only learning how to paint with a certain skin tone? Are we doing everybody? Because I feel like that's important as an artist to know, because that's the job. I mean, to take from life. So I just wanted to say that about the art.
So in terms of kind of the politics of representation today, what's happening today, I mean, I love superheroes, but I don't study superheroes. And I have often not done that because I have found some of the most rewarding and experimental things in other genres. And so often I tell people, if they're getting frustrated by the marketing, the different types of the latest things that DC and Marvel are doing or whatever, to look at crowdfunded comics, digital comics, like I said before, to look at things like, going back to Image, I'm a big fan of Bitterroot. Both of two of the artists are from South Carolina, so shout out to Bitterroot. Things like Bitch Planet, which is still on hiatus. Things that are creator-owned and crowdsourced, to me, are doing some really interesting things, which raises a whole other question that I have when I think about the accessibility of some of those comics after the campaigns, and if they're not, if they're for limited audiences, how do we still collect them and save them to use in our classes? So I'm going to stop there, but those are some of the things that I look at for some more experimental comics that are coming out today and doing some interesting work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The comics world is really wide, so there's a lot there, and so I don't think I could make a statement about the politics of representation across comics. I do think in superhero comics, let's just say Marvel and DC, because there are other companies that do superheroes too, but Marvel and DC, the current trend is towards a kind of diversification in characters, which really is kind of an expansion, when I think about it, of the brief strategy of that in the 1970s when Nubia came along, and then you had the Black Green Lantern, and you basically blackened up. That's a mean way to say it, but you had black versions of the main characters, of famous characters, and they're doing that kind of now, doing it more widely, doing it smarter. Whether it's really interesting or not is another question. Sometimes I think you get some really good or some fine comics like Ms. Marvel. Sometimes you get stuff that is just not so great. But it often looks good. I can say that. I mean, I enjoy seeing the faces colored, interestingly, differently than they have been in the past. But the more interesting work does tend to be, that's been the case for a long time, but creator-owned, independent, as far as representation goes. And there are a lot of people who are, people always like to talk about, in literature anyway, the death of literature, or like, oh, there are no more English majors and blah, 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 blah. But I see a lot of creators doing a lot of work in comics and fantasy genre. There's just a lot of people who are working in what we can think of as good representation, or interesting or rich representation, or unexpected representation that's been outside the mainstream in those areas. Yeah.
Open it up to questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you. I noticed that when you all were talking about representation in comics, you were talking somewhere between the static image and the way that it's placed in a narrative. And I think that sort of narrative enclosure is really important to understanding the value of any instance of representation, whose story is being told, and how effectively is it being told. And I think that's one of the things that makes comics unique as a format is that there's pictorial representation and also narrative enclosure that contextualizes these images. My question is mostly for Darieck and Qiana, that the two of you sort of talked around this topic of the fact that these representations are enclosed into narratives that sometimes like function well to create Black characters that feel complete, and other times rely on caricature in both the construction of the character and in the construction of the pictorial representation. And I'm interested to know, like, Qiana, your talk was so much about the paratext, what the reader brings to the comic when they walk into the store or the newsstand. And Darieck, your question was so much about the contents of the text, or your talk was so much about the content of the text. I was wondering, like, is there an active negotiation there where to read comics, we have to let go of some of the paratext, or if when we read comics and we bring this paratext to it, are we like limiting the ways in which we can read the racial potentials that are embedded into the text?
Could you just say a little bit more about what you mean by paratext?
These elements outside of the text, the like, you know, context of racist or of like, you know, racial tensions in America that come to bear on the way that a white reader might read all Negro comics, or the way a Black reader might read all Negro comics. Am I still not making sense?
No, so the notion then would be what happens when we kind of put some of those expectations and assumptions aside and sort of take a kind of like a new historicist view of the text separate from those things?
Yeah, essentially.
Well, I think you.
I think that's kind of impossible. And I'm not, well, I shouldn't say it's impossible. One can take a critical stance in any particular way, and you can have a methodology which allows you to read things in whatever way you want to read them. I'm not sure what the payoff necessarily is in being completely, as it were, text/picture bound, or having a sort of new historicist kind, or like new criticism maybe is what you're thinking. I'm not sure. New criticism way of thinking about a comic, because especially when it comes to, but I don't even want to limit it to this. All representation has the paratext. Nothing is without a kind of education that has been inculcated in you from the culture wide as you would approach any representation, whether it's painting, movie, a comic. And even when I was talking about people not knowing how to read a comic, they're just codes that you have to absorb in order to interpret or in order to enter into any representation. So the paratext of one's expectations about any given reader's expectations about what race means, that it actually means something, even that assumption, which is questionable, is an assumption people are going to bring to it. So I think you kind of have to, in order to study comics, in order to also richly engage them, you're going to have to be kind of aware of those paratexts in some way. And I do think it is a question of always, on the one hand, seeing what does the individual work do, how does it narratively, as you say, enclose its depictions, what does it do in terms of what I often find to be even more rich than the narrative enclosure is the iconic, that is, how is it just visually represented in a given panel? I can get very interested in that. Those things are going to be balanced against the historical context in which it appears, the historical context in which it was created, if that context is completely removed from when it was created, like the all Negro comics that we're looking at it today. I mean, all these things are going to have to be calibrated. So one of the things Ramsey Fawaz, my friend, says is that comics make you do a lot of work. There's so much that goes into actually analyzing all the things that are happening, not just from the the fact that it's a combination of textual and visual, and the imagination of movement between panels and all that sort of stuff, but they're just all these sort of different analytic and methodological forms of analysis that you could bring and probably should bring to any comic if you're really trying to understand it fully.
Yeah, and I don't know if, so hearing Darieck talk about this and your question, if this line of thinking is a helpful contribution. But when I talk about something like Steamboat and Captain Marvel, for instance, and the group of high schoolers who went in protests and asked the publisher to pull it, one of the things I like to remind my students is one of the reasons why they were sort of empowered to go there and make that statement is because they were fans of Captain Marvel long before they showed up, right, at those offices. And they read those comics with Steamboat in them, comic after issue after issue, and they were fans. And to me, one of the things that's fascinating is the way that Black readers, any types of marginalized readers who aren't themselves represented on the page, have to figure out a way to pull what they can enjoy, to change in their mind, to be selective, to negotiate and maneuver, a way to say, I'm gonna still enjoy this story and take pleasure in it, even though there is this representation here that is in so many ways just offensive and dehumanizes who it thinks that I am or whatever. And I'm fascinated by the idea so that the process of which those readers enjoyed that comic and then said, not I'm going to put it aside or I'm going to abandon this medium, but let's go see what we can do to change it, right? And I find that, I think I'm probably not really addressing totally the question that you initially posed, but I only mention it to say that I think even for readers like that who in some ways have to look past and ignore certain context or paratext in order to still keep buying the issues. I mean, I think that's something, I'm a big fan of Stephen King, but he doesn't know how to write Black characters. Like there's something that maneuver is really interesting to me, and I think maybe helps to speak to some of the things that you're bringing up, but anyway.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. On this note of being a fan, I'm really interested in hearing everybody's kind of take or views of being a critical reader and what that relationship is to being a fan. So before, you were talking about how comics is definitely marginalized as a medium, especially in academic context, but also I think you could maybe say the same thing about analyzing comics as a fan versus, and whether or not we should be trying to be objective. I'm curious to hear more.
I think I got lost in my thoughts about it. So you're asking, like, what is it like to be a critical reader of comics? So as both a fan and as an analyst, I guess.
I guess to put it really simply, do you feel like you have to maybe show that you're being objective and kind of step away from a fan sort of identity to read? Or, what is, what do you see as being expected in order to conduct a really convincing or, quote, serious reading?
I find with media in general, you kind of have to take all of it. We were talking about censorship yesterday and how we navigate, but you have to take the whole picture. So I don't know if you can be objective, or I guess that is objectivity, but just take it as a whole, really.
Yeah, I don't sort of make claims about objectivity, but I think it's really hard. It has been challenging for comic studies scholars who we're moving further and further away from a moment where you have to sort of demonstrate your relationship to the field in order to be qualified to then talk about it. The first time I taught a comics class, I remember I had a parent who called and asked, what were my credentials and how much I knew about comics in order to teach that class. I don't get those calls anymore, but there's still some ways that there's still communities of scholars who do police other critics in that way. If you don't know that this happened in issue 22 on this day and this, so that still happens, but it's happening less, and that there are more and more people who are acknowledging, I may not know all of this history or have come through all of this, but I can do my homework on the subject. And so that means that the field can be more inclusive and can bring in students who maybe didn't grow up reading comics in the same way that those in previous generations have. So, I guess, yeah, that's what I would add.
Yeah, I would add to that too, that there is a kind of trickiness when it comes to needing to kind of do that sort of ground clearing work of saying, okay, comics, and this is what I'm interested in, and this is serious, and yet also I'm a big fan, and kind of doing all the, and then here's what all this is, giving the whole sort of history all the time that you're saying anything, having to always mention Frederick Wortham and whatever. But I do think that's becoming less and less of an issue, just as the study of comics gets more established, and you can frame it whatever way you want to more and more. I think for me, I have been, at least through the writing of my last book, Keeping It Unreal, that I've been interested in not stepping away from a fan position, but in trying to theorize the fan position, that at least my fandom. What was my fandom about? Which means that it's not just about reading the comic, and it's also not just about, with whatever kind of methodological way I would do that, and it's also not just about talking about the whole history of the particular comic, or raising my flag and saying I'm a bona fide fan. It's just what was my particular investment in this, and that's has been a rich area for me to think about, just for me, and I hopefully for my work as well. But I don't think I'd have to always do it either. I just think that's been a question I've kind of wanted to investigate for myself.
Well, thank you so much. I wish we could continue this discussion for much longer, but it's 4:30, so it's time. I think that the table is set for anybody who wants to buy and get their comic signed.
Oh, good stuff.
Thank you so much for an amazing discussion.